After a humiliating overseas stumble, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez refused to disappear. Instead, she challenged Donald Trump to a nationally televised showdown that drew millions, promised redemption, and spiraled into something far worse. What began as a bold act of political defiance turned into a ruthless public test of credibility, competence, image, power, and one unforgettable question. Following the events in Germany, a wave of quiet advice rushed toward Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from every corner of the political world. Strategists, donors, veteran operatives, and even sympathetic allies suggested the same cautious strategy with almost identical language. Disappear for a while, they said. Allow the noise to fade. Return to your district and let the media cycle devour something else. In Washington, silence is often the most powerful form of damage control, and many believed time alone would bury the embarrassment that had begun spreading across the internet. She rejected that entire strategy without hesitation and instead chose the most dangerous political path imaginable. Rather than retreat into obscurity, she stepped directly into the center of the storm and did the one thing every advisor warned her never to attempt. Broadcasting live to nearly 3 million viewers on social media, she looked directly into the camera and issued a public challenge to the sitting Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Her tone was not cautious, apologetic, or diplomatic. It carried the unmistakable edge of defiance from someone determined to transform humiliation into confrontation. She dared Donald Trump to meet her face-to-face in a nationally televised debate and defend the insults he had been launching at her for weeks. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the challenge spread across every political platform in the country, moving through media networks and online forums with the speed of breaking news. Cable commentators argued over whether the move was courageous or catastrophically reckless. Some journalists called it unprecedented, pointing out that no active American president had ever agreed to publicly debate a relatively junior member of Congress in such a direct format. Others described the challenge as the political equivalent of stepping into a ring with a fighter known for turning every match into a spectacle. A day later, the response arrived. Donald Trump posted 3 words on his personal platform asking for the details. The message was short, blunt, and unmistakable in its meaning. He had accepted the challenge. Inside her campaign headquarters, the announcement detonated like a firecracker. Her advisors attempted to frame the moment as historic, describing the upcoming confrontation as proof that a young progressive lawmaker could force the most powerful political figure in the country to answer her directly. Financial backers celebrated the moment with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. To them, the debate was not merely entertainment, but a critical test that would determine whether she could evolve from an energetic activist politician into a credible national leader. 2 weeks later, the confrontation arrived. The debate would be broadcast live during prime time on a major conservative television network, a choice that immediately triggered protests from liberal media outlets. Despite their complaints, every major station still carried the broadcast simultaneously because ignoring an event expected to attract tens of millions of viewers was impossible. By the time the cameras were scheduled to roll, an estimated 23 million Americans were preparing to watch. The location was carefully selected to amplify the sense of drama. Instead of a small television studio, the network chose an enormous auditorium known for hosting major political events. The building's interior featured towering chandeliers, rows of deep red theater seats, and the kind of architecture designed to make any moment feel historic. Only 400 audience members were permitted inside, divided equally between guests selected by the network and individuals invited by the Congresswoman's campaign. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez approached the moment with intense preparation. For nearly 2 weeks, she isolated herself inside a rented meeting space in southern New York City, where her team ran non-stop rehearsal sessions. She studied thick binders filled with policy proposals, economic data, and legislative statistics. During mock debates, a campaign staffer played the role of Trump by shouting insults, interrupting her sentences, and attempting to derail her arguments in the middle of explanations. Her strategy relied heavily on visual communication. Throughout her congressional career, she had gained attention for using printed charts during hearings to illustrate wealth inequality, rising healthcare costs, and economic trends. For this debate, her team prepared half a dozen large presentation boards, each printed with carefully designed graphics and bold color schemes. They were placed on a stand beside her lectern, ready to be deployed whenever she needed to illustrate a point. Meanwhile, the other participant approached the event very differently. Earlier that day, Donald Trump spent the morning playing golf at his Florida estate before boarding his official aircraft for the flight to Washington. During the trip, a staff member asked whether he wanted to rehearse possible questions. Trump dismissed the suggestion immediately, claiming he already understood his opponent better than she understood herself. A junior aide eventually handed him a single sheet summarizing her policy positions. He glanced at the page for less than a minute, before folding it and placing it in his jacket pocket. When another staffer mentioned that she planned to use visual charts during the debate, he laughed and compared the idea to a middle school science fair. For the first time that day, he appeared genuinely amused. Half an hour before the broadcast began, the Congresswoman arrived at the auditorium. Her team quickly arranged the presentation boards and checked the microphones while technicians adjusted the lighting. Standing behind the lectern, she looked across the vast room at the rows of spectators filling the red seats beneath the chandeliers. For a moment, she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, steadying herself for the moment she believed would define her career. Donald Trump entered the building several minutes later, surrounded by security agents and the restless energy that always accompanied his appearances. Walking past her presentation boards, he paused briefly to examine the first chart describing economic inequality during his administration. Turning to an assistant, he made a casual remark that she had apparently brought homework to the debate. Then he ignored the displays entirely. When the broadcast began, the moderator explained the rules. Each participant would receive 2 minutes for initial answers and 1 minute for rebuttals. Both nodded in agreement. Those rules would collapse within 15 minutes. The first topic addressed the rising cost of living. The moderator asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to outline her strategy for confronting soaring housing prices, expensive groceries, and the cost of medical care. She began confidently, speaking in a steady tone that blended rehearsed policy language with emotional appeals directed toward working families. Instead of looking at Trump, she focused her gaze directly into the camera, addressing viewers across the country. She described escalating rent prices, shrinking paychecks, and families forced to ration medication. Then, she stepped toward her first presentation board and pointed to the chart illustrating living expenses during Trump's presidency. The movement had been practiced dozens of times during rehearsals. Trump did not wait for his turn. Turning toward the moderator with the relaxed posture of someone who had spent years dominating television, he interrupted to joke about the colorful charts beside her. He asked whether she planned to decorate them with stickers. Roughly half the audience burst into laughter. The moment instantly shifted the atmosphere. Instead of focusing on the statistics, viewers were now watching the spectacle of a seasoned entertainer mocking his opponent's carefully prepared props. The Congresswoman tried to continue explaining the data while gripping her pointer tightly, but the visual presentation had already lost its authority. Trump pressed the attack. He questioned how much money had been spent producing the charts and sarcastically referenced a previous ethics issue involving expensive gifts she had once received. The auditorium erupted again. Less than 2 minutes into the debate, she had still not finished her opening statement. She attempted to redirect the conversation back to economic policy, insisting that Americans deserved serious legislative solutions. Trump responded by listing what he described as his own economic accomplishments, including low unemployment and rising markets. The moderator tried to restore order, but Trump continued speaking over him. He pointed out that the Congresswoman had represented her district for nearly a decade and asked why housing costs in that area had risen so sharply during her time in office. Repeating the length of her tenure for emphasis, he argued that blaming him for local rent increases made no sense when she had been the elected official responsible for the district. Then he delivered a sarcastic suggestion. Instead of displaying a chart blaming him for the problem, he said she should present a new sign with her own photograph on it, admitting she had accomplished nothing. The crowd reacted instantly. Her campaign staff had trained her to expect interruptions, but nothing prepared her for the psychological effect of an audience laughing while she attempted to explain policy. The presentation board beside her now looked less like a tool of persuasion and more like a prop in a comedy routine. It stood there awkwardly, bright colors visible under the studio lights, while the conversation drifted far away from the statistics printed on it. She made another attempt to regain control, insisting the nation deserved to hear real legislative ideas rather than insults. Trump agreed loudly, claiming he had already provided exactly that by discussing economic growth. According to him, the only thing she had presented was a collection of colorful art projects. The moderator shuffled his notes and looked down at the desk. Across the country, tens of millions of viewers began realizing that what had been advertised as a serious political debate was rapidly transforming into something very different. The Congresswoman had prepared for an intellectual argument. Her opponent had arrived ready to stage a performance, and the audience was already enjoying the show. The moderator finally managed to steer the conversation toward the next subject, attempting to restore a sense of structure to the evening before the entire event slipped fully into chaos. He introduced the issue of economic inequality and asked the Congresswoman to explain her widely publicized proposal for dramatically increasing taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez immediately abandoned the visual charts and instead leaned toward the microphone, speaking rapidly while fixing her eyes on the broadcast camera rather than the man beside her. Her argument centered on the idea that the richest individuals in the country often paid a lower percentage of their income than ordinary workers. To illustrate the point, she mentioned one of the most famous technology billionaires in the world, presenting him as an example of concentrated wealth that could be taxed more aggressively. Trump reacted instantly. Tilting his body slightly away from the podium, he seized on the name she had just mentioned and repeated it slowly, emphasizing the billionaire's identity in a tone that suggested he had been waiting for exactly that opening. He acknowledged that the businessman had become extremely unpopular among many progressive voters. Then, he began listing the enormous number of employees working for the man's aerospace, automotive, and technology companies. Turning toward the audience, he asked a simple question about how many jobs the Congresswoman herself had ever created. He paused briefly and pretended to count on his fingers. After a moment, he closed his hand and held up a fist to represent 0. The crowd erupted again, and even several people seated in the Congresswoman's section struggled to suppress their reactions. Trump congratulated her sarcastically for wanting to punish a man who employed tens of thousands of workers while she herself had produced no comparable economic activity. She attempted to continue her argument, explaining that higher taxes on extreme wealth were not meant as punishment, but as a mechanism for funding social programs. Trump leaned toward the microphone again before she could complete the explanation. He praised the slogan she had once used during a famous public appearance demanding higher taxes on the rich. Then he asked whether she remembered where she had worn that slogan. Without waiting for an answer, he began describing a well-known annual fashion gala in New York City, an event famous for attracting the wealthiest celebrities and financiers in the country. He listed the price of admission to the exclusive gathering and mentioned several famous billionaires who attended regularly. Finally, he pointed out that the Congresswoman herself had attended the same event, wearing a dress emblazoned with the words, "Tax the Rich." The audience reaction arrived instantly. Trump explained that the controversy surrounding that appearance had become even more embarrassing when a congressional ethics investigation discovered she had failed to pay the designer who created the dress. He described the multi-year inquiry that eventually concluded with a formal violation and a financial penalty. Turning to the moderator, he admitted openly that he had attended countless lavish events throughout his own life. He made no attempt to hide his wealth or pretend otherwise. The difference, he said, was simple. He never walked into a room full of wealthy people wearing clothing, demanding they pay more taxes, while simultaneously failing to pay the bill for the outfit itself. According to him, that was not merely hypocrisy, but something closer to comedy. He suggested that if her real goal was entertaining people, she might have a future on a streaming platform, but he strongly advised her against seeking the presidency. The Congresswoman attempted to defend the appearance by explaining that the gala functioned as a charity event supporting a major museum. Trump dismissed the explanation immediately. He described the event as a glamorous celebration filled with expensive wine, famous photographers, and celebrities arriving in luxury vehicles while reporters shouted their names. "Real charity," he said, "rarely involves walking down red carpets in front of fashion magazines." He emphasized that the average residents of her district would never be allowed inside that exclusive gathering. The only people from her neighborhood who attended were herself and her boyfriend, both present because they had become media personalities rather than because of their political positions. He pointed out that the couple had not even paid for their tickets. The Congresswoman opened her mouth to respond, paused, and closed it again while searching for words. Trump had already moved on to the next part of the story. He delivered the details with the rhythm of a stage comedian, each sentence timed perfectly to trigger another wave of laughter. What made the attack so effective was that every detail was factual. There was no exaggeration required when the facts themselves already sounded absurd. Truth delivered as humor is almost impossible to defend against in real time, and the audience felt it. The moderator attempted to regain control again by introducing the next subject. He asked the Congresswoman to identify the most significant legislative achievement of her time in Congress. Her campaign team had feared this exact moment from the beginning. She stepped closer to the microphone and delivered the response she had rehearsed repeatedly during preparation sessions. Government success, she said, could not be measured only by counting the number of laws passed. Influence could also be measured by shifting the national conversation. She argued that her work had moved issues like climate reform, universal health care, and income inequality from the political margins directly into the center of public debate. According to her, those ideas had once been dismissed as radical, but were now widely discussed because she and her allies forced the country to confront them. Trump repeated her phrase slowly, shifting the conversation. He looked at the moderator and reminded him that the original question had been about actual laws. The audience waited quietly as he drew out the moment, allowing the absurdity of the answer to settle over the room. Then he delivered the conclusion himself. 0. According to him, she had spent nearly a decade in office without successfully passing a single piece of major legislation. He reminded viewers of her sweeping environmental proposal that had once been promoted as a plan to transform the American economy. The bill, he said, never even reached a full vote. It died before it ever reached the floor. He acknowledged that she had enormous crowds at rallies in California and massive followings on social media platforms. Those gatherings looked impressive on camera, but he compared them to the crowds attending concerts by famous pop stars. Large audiences, he said, do not qualify someone to run a country. The reaction was overwhelming. Even people who supported the Congresswoman struggled to hide their amusement at the bluntness of the comparison. One woman wearing a campaign badge in the audience raised her hand to cover her mouth, attempting to disguise a laugh that escaped before she could stop it. Trump was not finished. He mocked the nationwide tour she had conducted with a well-known socialist senator while campaigning against wealthy elites. The irony, he pointed out, was that the senator owned multiple houses, including a vacation property overlooking a lake. Trump jokingly suggested renaming the senator based on his real estate holdings. According to him, their political rallies resembled concerts rather than policy discussions. People attended for excitement, applauded dramatic speeches, and then went home without seeing any meaningful change in their lives. He described the entire progressive movement surrounding the Congresswoman as a theatrical production rather than a governing philosophy. He admitted that he appreciated good entertainment. After all, he had built an entire career around television before entering politics. But entertainment and leadership were not the same thing. He contrasted her rallies with what he described as his own record of tangible accomplishments. Buildings constructed, economic agreements negotiated, foreign adversaries confronted. Those were results, he said. Meanwhile, the only concrete achievement she could claim was accumulating millions of followers on a social media application. According to him, those followers would not reduce rent prices or make groceries cheaper for ordinary families. The Congresswoman finally raised her voice in an attempt to push back. She accused him of laughing at her record while his administration had cut massive funding from public health programs. She warned that vulnerable children and elderly citizens would suffer because of those policies. Trump did not engage with the statistics she began citing. Instead, he shifted the conversation again, asking whether she had heard about a massive fraud case involving pandemic relief funds in the Midwest. Hundreds of millions of dollars, he said, had been stolen from programs designed to feed poor children. His administration had frozen the payments while investigators examined the corruption. According to him, the Progressive Coalition immediately accused the government of cruelty for halting the money. But none of those same critics had spoken loudly about the criminals who actually stole the funds. He turned toward the moderator and claimed the Congresswoman used social programs the same way she used the fashion gala and the presentation boards earlier in the debate. They were props in a performance designed to attract attention rather than tools for solving problems. At that moment, something shifted visibly in her posture. Her thick folders of statistics remained on the floor beside the podium, untouched. The colorful charts stood behind her unused. The preparation that had consumed 2 weeks of intense rehearsal suddenly felt irrelevant. Her opponent was not debating policy. He was dismantling her credibility in front of millions of viewers, and the audience was watching every second of it. The moderator, clearly aware that the evening had already veered far away from the orderly format originally planned, carefully shifted the conversation toward foreign policy. He referenced the Congresswoman's recent trip to a European security conference and the controversy that had followed her appearance there. Before he could finish describing the situation, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez interrupted him. She knew the topic was coming and she had prepared for it. If the discussion moved toward international affairs, she intended to reclaim control of the stage. She began speaking quickly, outlining the speeches she had delivered to international leaders regarding economic inequality, conflicts in the Middle East, and the dangers posed by rising authoritarian governments around the world. Her tone carried urgency and determination, the same style that had energized thousands of supporters during campaign rallies. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might regain the momentum that had been slipping away since the opening minutes of the debate. But the illusion lasted only a few seconds. Trump leaned slightly toward the microphone and uttered a single word: Berlin. The way he pronounced the city's name carried the unmistakable enthusiasm of someone introducing the audience to a favorite story. He told viewers that he had watched the Congresswoman's appearance at the conference, along with millions of other Americans who had seen the video circulating online. Then he encouraged anyone who had not yet seen the clip to search for it after the debate. According to him, the question she had faced in Germany had been extremely simple. Any candidate seeking the highest office in the United States, he argued, should possess an immediate answer when asked about defending a strategic island in Asia against aggression from a major rival power. He began to recount her response, pausing deliberately before continuing as though setting up the punchline to a joke. Then he performed the imitation. Word for word, he recreated the moment from the conference, reproducing the hesitation, the stammering pauses, the unfinished sentences, and the uncertain tone that had filled the original clip. The impression was so accurate that the audience began laughing before he even finished repeating her answer. It was not merely an insult or exaggeration. It was a perfect reenactment. Hundreds of people inside the auditorium and tens of millions watching at home witnessed the former president mimic the exact woman who was attempting to challenge him for national leadership. The reason the imitation landed so brutally was because it contained no distortion. Everything he repeated had been recorded on video and viewed millions of times already. He concluded the performance by referencing a famous moment from a beauty pageant years earlier when a contestant had delivered a notoriously incoherent answer to a simple question. Quoting a portion of the contestant's response, he compared it directly to the Congresswoman's explanation in Berlin. Then he added a devastating observation. The teenager in the pageant had only been competing for a crown. The woman standing beside him wanted control of the world's most powerful military. The laughter returned instantly. Before the Congresswoman could respond, Trump launched into the next example. He reminded the audience of another statement she had made during the same trip. During a discussion about political instability in South America, she had mistakenly claimed that a particular country was located in the southern half of the globe. In reality, the entire nation sits above the equator. Trump informed the moderator that the dictator of that country had recently been captured during an operation authorized by his administration. The man responsible for years of repression and starvation in his own nation was now sitting in a prison cell. Yet the politician attempting to replace him as president could not even identify the country's location on a map. According to Trump, basic geographic knowledge was the minimum requirement for someone who expected to command military forces around the world. He compared the skill to literacy, suggesting that knowing where countries were located might even be slightly easier than reading. The Congresswoman's anger was visible now. She gripped the edges of the lectern and fired back, accusing him of violating international law when his administration carried out the operation to capture the dictator. She argued that such actions risked turning the United States into a rogue state that ignored global agreements. The room fell quiet. Trump's demeanor changed instantly. The playful entertainer who had been joking moments earlier disappeared, replaced by a colder and more deliberate presence. His voice lowered and his words slowed as he responded. He explained that the man currently imprisoned had ruled his country through fear and starvation for nearly a decade. Children in that nation had been forced to eat garbage because their government diverted food supplies to maintain power. Hospitals ran out of medicine while the regime enriched itself. Trump described visiting intelligence briefings that documented infants dying in clinics because basic antibiotics were unavailable. He paused briefly before continuing. Then he contrasted those images with the scene inside the auditorium. A politician dressed in an expensive suit was standing beneath glittering chandeliers, criticizing the arrest of the tyrant responsible for those conditions. According to Trump, the people in that country were finally receiving food because the regime had been dismantled, and she did not even know where the country was located. The auditorium became completely silent. For the first time during the entire broadcast, the audience stopped reacting. No laughter, no applause, no interruptions, just silence. The Congresswoman remained gripping the lectern, while the weight of the moment settled over the room. Her charts remained unused beside her. The thick folders filled with statistics were still stacked on the floor near her shoes. All the preparation that had consumed the previous 2 weeks suddenly seemed irrelevant. She had spent hours memorizing policy details and rehearsing arguments about legislation. None of those rehearsed answers addressed the image Trump had just described. Starving children, a dictator in prison, and a candidate who could not identify the nation on a map. The moderator hesitated, unsure how to break the tension that now filled the auditorium. 10 seconds passed, which during a live broadcast felt like an eternity. Neither debater spoke. Finally, the moderator announced that the program was moving to closing statements. Each participant would have one final opportunity to address the American public. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened her posture and stepped closer to the microphone. This was the speech she had rehearsed the most during preparation. The narrative that had fueled her rise from a local bartender to a national political figure. She reminded viewers that less than a decade earlier she had been serving drinks in her neighborhood bar. She spoke about the anxiety of struggling to pay rent and the fear of choosing between groceries and electricity bills. Those experiences, she said, were the reason she entered politics. Working families deserved representation from people who understood their struggles firsthand. Her time expired before she could complete the speech. The moderator turned to Trump for his closing remarks. He did not use the full time allotted to him. Instead, he began by acknowledging her background, stating that he had no reason to doubt that she had worked long hours serving customers. He even complimented the profession, calling service workers some of the hardest working people in the country. Then he paused. The pause was deliberate. He pointed out that she had left that profession years ago. Since then, she had spent nearly a decade holding public office. According to him, the real question was simple. What had changed in her district during that time? He reminded viewers about the luxury fashion gala, the unpaid dress, the European conference. Then he looked directly into the camera. Instead of speaking to the Congresswoman beside him, he addressed the millions of voters watching across the country. If someone cannot fix the problems in a single neighborhood after nearly 10 years in office, he asked, how could that same person possibly repair an entire nation? The question hung in the air. And for the first time all night, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had no response. The silence that followed the question did not resemble the earlier pauses filled with laughter or sarcastic applause. This quiet was different, heavier, the kind of stillness that settles over a courtroom when the outcome has already become obvious to everyone present. The Congresswoman remained standing behind her lectern, the bright studio lights reflecting faintly off the unused charts positioned beside her. For someone known across Washington for rapid responses and constant rebuttals, the absence of words suddenly became the most striking moment of the entire broadcast. Millions of viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens, waiting for an answer that did not arrive. The moderator cleared his throat softly and reminded her that she still had time to respond if she wished. She parted her lips, began forming a sentence about fighting tirelessly for working families, and then hesitated. Trump did not even turn toward her when he responded quietly into his microphone. According to him, fighting endlessly was not the same thing as fixing anything. The short remark carried a blunt finality that made further explanation seem almost impossible. The audience did not laugh this time. There were no cheers or applause. Instead, a subdued murmur spread through the auditorium as viewers processed the brutal simplicity of the exchange. For the remainder of the broadcast, the atmosphere resembled a formal proceeding where the verdict had already been understood long before the judge announced it. The moderator finally declared the debate concluded and thanked both participants for attending. Trump stepped away from his podium almost immediately, raising one hand casually toward the crowd in a relaxed gesture that suggested the evening had unfolded exactly as he expected. Security agents gathered around him as he walked toward the exit with the easy stride of someone leaving a golf course after finishing a comfortable round. The Congresswoman did not move right away. For several seconds, she remained standing alone behind the lectern while technicians dimmed the stage lighting. Members of her campaign staff hurried onto the platform, quickly collecting the expensive presentation boards that had never been used. Another aide gathered the thick folders of policy documents that had remained closed throughout the debate. As she walked toward the backstage corridor, a television camera from the network captured her expression briefly. There were no visible tears and no outward anger. What appeared instead was a vacant stare, the look of someone quietly reassessing an entire narrative about who they believed themselves to be. Within minutes, the footage from the event began flooding the internet. Clips of the debate spread across social media platforms with the speed of a viral storm. The first moment to explode online was the final question about her district. By sunrise, the video had been viewed nearly 60 million times. What made the clip so powerful was not humor or editing. It simply articulated a doubt that many voters had quietly carried for years but had never heard expressed so directly on national television. The question required no complicated explanation and no ideological argument. It was brutally simple. Another clip quickly followed, this one focusing on the comparison between her massive political rallies and concerts by a famous pop singer. Entrepreneurs began printing novelty merchandise featuring the quote, "before the auditorium had even fully cleared of spectators." Within 24 hours, shirts and posters bearing the phrase appeared across online marketplaces. The third viral moment involved the imitation of her answer from the European conference. An anonymous user edited the clip alongside footage of the beauty pageant contestant whose answer Trump had referenced. The side-by-side comparison accumulated tens of millions of views within a single day. Another popular compilation highlighted the controversy surrounding the fashion gala dress and the ethics investigation that followed. Images of the gown were placed next to official documents describing the penalty she received for the violation. The juxtaposition became one of the most widely shared political memes of the week. The final quote that spread across the internet was the quiet line about fighting versus fixing. Unlike the other clips, this phrase circulated without the debate footage attached. Teachers, veterans, nurses, and ordinary workers reposted the sentence on its own. It spread not as a joke, but as a statement many people felt captured a larger frustration with politics itself. For the next week, the conservative network that hosted the debate devoted nearly continuous programming to analyzing the event. One commentator called it the most uneven political confrontation ever broadcast on television. Another host joked that the Congresswoman had entered a heavyweight boxing match carrying nothing but classroom supplies. Even centrist news outlets acknowledged that the evening had been disastrous for her campaign. A respected political analyst summarized the situation bluntly during a late-night broadcast. According to him, the Congresswoman had prepared for a policy discussion while her opponent engineered a spectacle designed to entertain millions of viewers. And the country had chosen entertainment. The political consequences arrived quickly. Within 48 hours, several wealthy donors who had been quietly considering funding her presidential campaign withdrew their interest. One financier, speaking anonymously to a national newspaper, admitted that backing a candidate whose most famous public moment resembled a pageant interview disaster was simply not a viable investment. Poll numbers soon confirmed the damage. A survey conducted in an early primary state showed her support dropping from 15% to just 6% within 2 weeks. Candidates who had previously trailed her suddenly moved ahead. Among older progressive voters, the demographic most likely to participate in early primaries, her numbers collapsed even more dramatically. Her younger supporters remained fiercely loyal. College students and progressive activists continued defending her online, praising her willingness to challenge powerful opponents directly. But the broader coalition needed to win a national election was beginning to fracture. Allies in Washington responded cautiously. One progressive colleague posted a short message praising her dedication to working families, but avoided mentioning the debate itself. Another ally released no statement at all. The socialist senator, who had once shared massive rally stages with her, eventually issued a carefully worded memo describing her as a gifted communicator. He did not refer to her as a future president. The Congresswoman returned to New York that same evening, skipping her apartment in Washington and traveling directly to the neighborhood that had launched her political career. Her partner met her at the door of their small apartment near the campaign office. He had watched the entire debate unfold on television. There were no comforting illusions left to offer. She collapsed onto the couch without removing the clothes she had worn during the broadcast. Her phone buzzed repeatedly as advisors attempted to contact her about responding to the media storm already building outside. Eventually, she answered a call from her campaign manager. The question was simple. Should they go live online immediately or wait until morning? Throughout her career, the solution to every political setback had been the same. Turn on the camera, speak directly to supporters, and bypass traditional media entirely. The digital platforms where she built her reputation rewarded emotional immediacy over careful analysis. She agreed to start the live stream. In the bedroom, the lighting equipment remained permanently assembled, ready for moments exactly like this. She sat down in front of the camera with slightly smeared makeup and began speaking to millions of viewers who joined the broadcast within seconds. She admitted that the debate had not gone well, but she insisted that perfection had never been her goal. Her mission, she said, was to fight. She argued that many leaders within her own political movement were too afraid to confront Trump directly. She named several prominent figures and accused them of hiding behind cautious statements rather than engaging him publicly. She had stepped into the arena. If voters wanted a flawless politician who never made mistakes, she said they should look somewhere else. What she offered instead was passion, authenticity, and the willingness to challenge power directly. Supportive messages flooded the comment feed instantly. But buried deep among the praise was one message from a woman in her district. The viewer wrote that she admired the Congresswoman's courage, but asked a blunt question about rising rent prices in the neighborhood. Thousands of other users quickly liked the comment. The Congresswoman ignored it. Several blocks away from her apartment stood the small bar where she had once worked years earlier. On the night of the debate, the establishment was unusually crowded. People gathered around the television mounted above the counter to watch a replay of the broadcast. The bartender serving drinks that evening was about the same age she had been when she worked there. One of the regular customers, an older maintenance worker who had voted for her in every election, tapped his glass on the counter and asked for the volume to be raised. When Trump's final question about the district echoed through the speakers, the man finished his drink and stared quietly at the young bartender. For the first time since her original campaign, he admitted that the question might have a point. The bartender did not respond. He wiped the counter slowly, while the replay continued on the screen above him. Like many others in the neighborhood, he had once believed strongly in her promise to transform local politics. But that night, something had changed. The patrons continued watching the broadcast, yet nobody in the bar mentioned her name again. The silence did not come from anger or hostility. It came from the uneasy realization that enthusiasm alone had never repaired a neighborhood, and slogans printed on colorful charts would never pay the rent.